Hi, I'm Dilip Gaonkar, Director for Center for Global Culture and Communication at Northwestern University and Director of Center for Transcultural Studies, an independent virtual scholarly network. Welcome to the Questioning the Present, an online forum jointly sponsored by these two centers. Today's 21st session of Questioning the Present is devoted to Professor Chiara Cordelli's The Privatized State, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. We have also a panel of three distinguished scholar respondents, Professor Nadia Urbinati, Blake Emerson, and Leah Downey. I'll introduce all four of our distinguished panelists shortly. Before that, let me state the protocols governing this online session. Our webmaster is Vidura Bahadur, a graduate student of Center for Global Culture and Communication. This session is recorded for archival purposes and it will be released to the public in a day or two, as we have already secured the permission of our four scholars assembled here. The session will unfold as follows. After my quick introduction of four panelists, Professor Cordelli will introduce her book, The Privatized State, for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by the three respondents, Professor Urbinati, Professor Emerson, and Professor Downey, and in that order. Each respondent will have 10 to 12 minutes to deliver their comments, followed by Professor Cordelli's response to her respondents for about 10 minutes. After that, we will start question and session, QA session, starting with a quick comment by three respondents if time permits. As for the question and answer session, please either raise your hand by using the reaction function on your screen or send a message to Vidura indicating that you wish to ask a question by using the chat function. You may also write out your question to in chat for Vidura to read to our audience and to the relevant panelists. That covers everything. Now to the brief introduction. Professor Chiara Cordelli is the author of the book we are discussing here today. The Privatized State is a professor of political science at University of Chicago. This book won the prize for the best first book in political theory given by the European Consortium of Political Research in 2021. Earlier in 2016, she co-edited and contributed to a volume on philanthropy in democratic societies. In addition, Cordelli has published numerous articles in prestigious journals in political science and philosophy. One of those articles, Justice as Fairness and Relational Resources, was included in Philosopher's Annual as one of the 10 best articles published in philosophy in 2015. Another, a book chapter, Philanthropy as a Duty for Reparative Justice, won 2018 Review of Politics Award. As evident from this abbreviated list of her publications, Cordelli's main areas of research are social and political philosophy, with a particular focus on theories of redistributive justice, political legitimacy, normative defenses of the state, and the public and private distinction in liberal theory. In the course of the last 15 years, Professor Cordelli has held series of fellowships, visiting positions at premier institutions. The Kluge Center at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., Center for Human Values at Princeton, Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, and Leah Center at IHAS in Paris. Now to our first respondent, Nadia Urbinati. I don't mean first respondent in the modern sense of the word. Okay. Uh, is professor of political theory at Columbia University. She specializes in modern and contemporary political thought and the democratic and anti-democratic traditions. Her more recent book, co-authored with one of my colleagues here at Northwestern, Christina Lafont, is The Lottocratic Mentality, Defending Democracy Against Lottocracy, was published just 2 months ago by Oxford University Press. Nadia is the author of another half a dozen influential books, Me the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy by Harvard in 2019. One received the Kapal Bio International Prize in 2020, and one of her early books in 2002, Mill on Democracy, From the Athenian Polis to the representative government, received the David and Elaine Spitz Prize as the best book in liberal democratic theory in 2004. In the interval between those two prize-winning books, she has published 3 books. I won't identify the names of all of them. She has published 2 edited volumes of selected works by 2 leading Italian political thinkers, Carlo Rosselli and Piero Gobetti. She has also co-edited 6 volumes on a wide range of topics in collaboration with distinguished lists of political theorists, and of course, numerous scholarly articles. One too many to list and identify them here. In recognition of such enormous scholarly achievement, Nadia has received many awards, fellowships, and visiting appointment. Lenfest Columbia Distinguished Faculty Award. She has been a member of Social Science, School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. She has held the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Fellowship at the Center for Human Values at Princeton. She is a member of the Executive Committee of the Foundation Reset Dialogue on Civilization. She's a permanent visiting professor at the Santa Ana School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, Italy. Finally, as early as 2008, President of the Italian Republic awarded Professor Urbinati the title, the Commander of the Italian Republic, nothing less. Next, we go to Blake Emerson, a JD PhD from Yale. He is currently a professor of law and a professor of political science at UCLA. Emerson's book, Public Law, Origins and Architecture of Progressive Democracy, published by Oxford University Press in 2019, offers a history and theory of democracy in American administrative state. His articles have appeared in major law journals across the country, Harvard, Yale, Penn, Minnesota, and so on. He is the co-editor of the 2nd and 3rd editions of Comparative Administrative Law. Emerson's primary research interests lie in administrative law, structural constitutional law, and political theory. His research examines the normative and historical foundations of American public law. He draws on resources from political theory and American political development to understand the structure and purpose of regulatory state. He studies questions such as what role have federal government agencies played in interpreting and implementing civil rights and other fundamental public values. In recognition of his innovative research, he received Administrative Law Section's Emerging Scholar Award from the Association American Law Schools in 2021. 4 years later, in 2025, he received the Early Career Scholar Medal from the American Law Institution. Clearly, Blake is a young man of great promise as he moves from emerging scholar to an early career scholar with a long and winding road ahead. Leah Downey is the Junior Research Fellow, the 3rd Respondent Fellow at the St. John's College, Cambridge, where she works on democratic theory and microeconomic policy making. Downey holds a BA in Mathematics and Economics from UNC Chapel Hill, an MS in Economics and Philosophy from LSE, and a PhD in Government from Harvard University. She is the author of the book, Our Money, Monetary Policy as If Democracy Matters, published just recently, last year in 2024, once again by Princeton University Press. In her book and in her subsequent publications on topics such as the administrative state, monetary policy, microfinancing and the green transition, and the meaning of stability in politics and economics, she keeps returning to the pressing question, what would it look like? What would it mean? What would it entail to democratize monetary policy? Recognizing that the creation and allocation of money are among the state's most distinctive powers, she asks, how might one devise and institute an approach to monetary policy making that respect the integrity of democratic deliberation and decision making? With that, my introductions come to an end. I hand over the floor to Professor Chiara Cordelli to introduce her book. Chiara?
So thank you very much, Dilip, for the kind introduction and for inviting me and to my illustrious commentators for taking the time to read the work and to discuss it with us today. So I wrote The Privatized State now a few years ago with two goals in mind. The first was to provide a normative diagnosis and a critique of what I take has been a crucial historical transformation of the mode of governing and of the modern administrative state. So if one may say that the 20th century was the age of the bureaucratization of the modern state with its expanded class of public officials and civil servants, the 21st century has been the age of its increasing internal privatization. We have seen attempts to privatize wholly or partially governmental function as different as the management of prisons and military services, for example, functions of adjudication through private arbitration, the funding of education through philanthropy, the provision of welfare and healthcare, and the setting of financial regulations. And the list could go on, and in fact, it seems that it does every day. So the result is that the administrative state, the ideal type of which I think is still in the mind of perhaps most contemporary political philosopher, the ideal type is constituted by a Weberian bureaucratic apparatus characterized by a vertical hierarchy of offices. This kind of state has been increasingly replaced by a privatized contracting state, where private actors increasingly replace public servants, and public servants themselves increasingly resemble at will private contractual employees. So the US is perhaps here the paradigmatic example of the privatized state, as I understand it, but similar changes have happened all over the world in different degrees, especially, of course, since the 1970s with the expansion of so-called neoliberalism. So if the first goal of this book was to provide a normative and diagnostic critique of this transformation, its second and perhaps more aspirational goal was to use this critique dialectically to develop a more positive democratic theory of public administration, one characterized by a sharp separation between public office and private contract, and on the one hand by a close integration between the bureaucratic and the democratic through the internal democratization of the bureaucracy itself. So let me start by saying a little more about how I understand the core normative problem with the privatized state and why I thought it deserved a book-length treatment. So we may say that until very recently, and Blake, Leah, and Bernardo Zacca are exception to this trend, but these are all very recent contributions. Until very recently, in Anglo-American political theory and philosophy, very little attention has been paid to the administrative state. So the field has been for long mostly preoccupied with theories of justice, political equality, and legitimacy, abstracting from specific institutions, but even those who have focused on institutions have tended to concentrate on constitutions, legislatures, elections, and Supreme Courts. So actual governance and administration have not been in this respect the object of sustained attention. And in fact, I think it's indicative, it's interesting that in Rawls's A Theory of Justice, the Bible of contemporary Anglo-American political philosophy, the word bureaucracy appears only once. And so it seemed that for at least a very long time, most political philosophy would agree with Locke that of ministerial and subordinate powers we need not speak. I take that, of course, from the second treaty. So if public administration has been fairly absent from normative theory, I think the same is true of privatization. And this is largely because I suspect most political philosophers have embraced a form of consequentialism, according to which ultimately at the fundamental level, public and private forms of action are interchangeable means for the achievement of independently defined ends, such as justice. So, and even when discussed, privatization is for the most part treated as a technocratic problem, a mere matter of policy that primarily responds to economic consideration. And recent debate in legal theory have focused, for example, on simply specific instances of privatization taken in isolation. For example, on the question of whether there are particular functions such as punishment that cannot be, conceptually speaking, performed by private actors. And finally, critiques of neoliberalism, I'm thinking here about Wendy Brown, for example, have treated the privatization of the public as one manifestation of a broader, all-pervasive form of neoliberal rationality, or others as a moral problem of commodification. So against this background, the first contribution of the book is to reframe the problem of privatization as a genuinely political problem concerning the transformation of the state and its democratic legitimacy. And here the core question I ask are very straightforward. So if in a privatized state, private actors are morphing into government, can they act with the legitimacy that government claims? And vice versa, can a government morphed into a network of private actors still govern those subject to it legitimately? So this question, I think, may sound rhetorical, especially if asked today, when entire parts of the US government have been literally appropriated by private actors who seem to lack at times any kind of official legitimacy. So the DOGE, the department head by Elon Musk, is an obvious example. But the privatized state often exhibits all the formal features of a legitimate state, a state whose agents have both the right and the moral standing to make and impose rules on subjects. So private actors, after all, are generally authorized by government through contract, can be subject to regulation, and it is therefore difficult to see why administering the public through the private would per se raise important legitimacy concern. And yet this is precisely so what I tried to argue in the first part of the book. So in this first part, I defend the claim that the fundamental normative problem with privatization is neither a mere matter of outcomes, nor one of corruption, nor one of commodification. Rather, the problem is that the privatized state is necessarily a contradictory and illegitimate state. And this is because the systematic privatization of public functions and thus the very rationale that justifies the existence of the democratic states to begin with. And this, importantly, is in spite of the apparently legitimizing power of contract. So to put the central claim more precisely, the problem with the privatized state is that it reproduces within a civil condition the very same problem of unilateral subjection, that is, of subjecting some to the merely unilateral and legislative will of others, a problem, ultimately a problem of domination, that analytically defines the pre-civil state as a condition of merely provisional justice, and the overcoming of which makes the creation of the state both justified and morally compelled. So privatization, a privatized state is a self-defeating state, is a state that defeats its own rationale of existence, its own reason d'être. So my normative critique of the privatized state then necessarily begins with a philosophical account of what justifies and legitimizes the democratic state to begin with. And here, against Lockeans, utilitarian, liberal egalitarians, I appeal to the political Kant, or at least a Kantian-inspired political theory, to defend the view that political institutions are not, in fact, interchangeable means to achieve an independently defined end of justice that could be also achieved through other private forms of actions, but rather political institutions are a constituent of justice, and this is because analytically speaking, justice cannot obtain in the absence of a shared political authority, because rights cannot be conclusive under a system of private adjudication and enforcement. So why is it the case that rights and those justice cannot be conclusive in a pre-civil state? The reason is not lack of assurance, as Hobbes would claim, but rather the reason is that the private determination and enforcement of rights necessarily gives rise to an incoherent state where freedom, our ability to form and pursue ends, simultaneously grounds a permissive authorization to acquire rights, because these are necessary conditions of freedom, but at the same time, freedom itself denies private parties the authority to impose binding obligation on others. Why do private parties necessarily lack the authority, even when they are well-intentioned, even when they are correct? Perhaps their determination are objectively right. Because the answer is binding others through private forms of judgment and action would necessarily subject these others to a merely unilateral and legislative will, something that would both violate their freedom as independents and disrespect their equal normative authority, because everyone ultimately has a right to stand by their own judgment. In sum, the pre-civil state is necessarily a state of domination and those of merely provisional justice, because, as Kant says, no one's unilateral will, no matter how correct, can be a legislative will for others. Now, as it is well known, Kantians believe that this problem can be overcome only if all decisions that have a legislative character are authorized by a will that is genuinely omnilateral and that is properly representative of everyone's will. And most Kantians here tend to argue that what this requires is that legislative determination must be a deserving object of people's hypothetical consent. So I take it that John Rawls' own theory, for example, of political legitimacy builds on this assumption. But instead here, departing from this tradition and in line with a more democratic revival of the political Kant, I argue that a commitment to reciprocal independence requires that all legislative determination be democratically sanctioned as far as both the authorization of fundamental laws, but also the making of ordinary law, and we will see also the actually administration of those laws are concerned. So from a Kantian justification of the democratic state, I think one can then easily derive an account of the conditions for the legitimate exercises of political power, and in particular of legislative power. To put it very briefly, right, first, in order to be legitimate, this exercise of legislative power must be omnilaterally authorized through an appropriately constituted democratic process. We can talk about later what that means. Second, exercises of such power must express a representative form of judgment. That is, they must be exercised in everyone's name. And this means that, yes, they must be representative of a collective will as it emerges from a democratic process, but such democratic process must itself be constitutionally constrained, non-sectarian, and must frame political issues in terms of competing interpretations of the general good. So in sum, and very briefly, the conditions for the legitimate exercise of legislative power include a minimum, an authorization, and a representation conditions. So in order to show that the privatized state reproduces within the civil condition the very same problem of unilateral subjection and those of domination which characterize the pre-civil state, I try to demonstrate that the privatized states necessarily amounts to an arrangement where quasi-legislative forms of power are systematically exercised in ways that lack both a valid authorization and a representative quality. And this is why being subject to a privatized state necessarily means being subject to a form of illegitimate rule. It is why, to put it more dramatically, the privatized state is a regression to the state of nature. So to put this maybe dramatic point more convincing and more practically, let me first say a little more as to why in a privatized state, private actors can be regarded as exercising a form of quasi-legislative power, because this is not at all obvious, since private actors in most cases seem to exercise merely executive power, such as the administration of prison or the delivery of welfare. But here I rely on an extensive literature in administrative law, which I think compellingly shows how within the modern administrative state, executive and legislative power cannot be sharply separated, and perhaps they should not be sharply separated in some cases. The reason, among others, is that intelligently implementing policies often implies not simply finding the right means for independently specified ends, but also implies a revision of those ends themselves. So instrumental rationality is never sufficient to intelligently implementing policies. But if administrators can revise the ends of policies, their exercise of discretion and of practical judgment cannot then be fully legitimized by appealing to conforming to those higher ends, because it's those very ends that end up changing through the process of interpretation and administration. So as a result, bureaucrats often end up exercising a kind of discretion that has a quasi-legislative and partly autonomous character, and this is often true also of street-level bureaucrats, who, for example, end up developing rules for establishing, say, eligibility criteria for accessing welfare services, or prison personnel who internally develop rules according to which then punishments are imposed. So in a privatized state, quasi-legislative and quasi-adjudicatory forms of political power are regularly transferred to private actors through delegation contracts. Now, from the perspective of legitimacy, the first question that we need to ask is whether private actors can be regarded as exercising these forms of political power under valid omnilateral authorization. And my claim is that they generally cannot. Here, the reason is that basically when a government engages in the systematic privatization of public function, it effectively abdicates the minimal precondition for democratic self-rule, which include, I take a minimum, collective democratic control over some core public function, civic vigilance, and also basic equality of opportunities for political influence. And the reason why systematic privatization can be regarded as an abdication of these preconditions for self-rule is that it both generates structural forms of state dependence on private actors that in turn undermine democratic control and political equality, and it also importantly submerges the face of the state, for example, under the market, in ways that undermine the affective attachment of citizens to political institutions, and so also their civic vigilance. So now a democratic government, I argue, lacks the right to abdicate people's collective right to self-rule, and those also its minimal preconditions. Therefore, it follows that a democratic government lacks the right to authorize systematic forms of privatization. This in turn means that in largely privatized states, private actors necessarily end up exercising quasi-legislative forms of power without a valid omnilateral form of authorization. They thus necessarily subject citizens to a merely unilateral and quasi-legislative will. But beyond acting under invalid authorization, private actors also lack the standing and the ethos to act in a representative capacity. So here in the book, I defend a particular account of representation. I argue that for representative to act in the name of another, it's not sufficient that representatives behaviorally act within the boundaries of a mandate, but rather successful representation in this sense requires that the representative also acts on the basis of reason, on the basis of considerations that are not excluded, and they are compatible with the nature of the mandate as valid reasons for actions. So here I believe that private actors fail to represent the public in this sense, and this is because qua private entities, they necessarily fail a conflict of obligations. On the one hand, they're under fiduciary obligation to pursue their company's goals, whether this be profit or religion, doesn't matter. But this in turn compels private actors to act on the basis of consideration that are excluded and should be excluded from the occupancy of a public role. That is, consideration that lack the status of valid reasons for action from the perspective of the public. So it follows that private actors end up exercising public forms of quasi-legislative powers in ways that are not only not validly authorized, but also not representative of a public will. They rather express and impose on citizens a private, non-omnilateral form of judgment. The result is that the privatized state systematically subjects citizens to the merely unilateral and quasi-legislative will of others, thereby reproducing within the state itself the very same problem of unilateral subjection and those of domination that the democratic state was morally necessitated and justified to overcome. And this is so in spite, again, the apparently legitimizing power of contract. And I think this is the sense in which the privatized state, as I mentioned earlier, constitute a regression to the state of nature, understood normatively as a condition of merely provisional justice from which we have a duty of justice to exit. So before I briefly sketch my vision of this exit, and those of a non-privatized form of public administration that would instead fulfill the demands of legitimacy, I want to briefly connect my argument to another and much more illustrious account of the problem of excessive compenetration between the public and the private spheres. So, of course, I have in mind Habermas' seminal analysis here in the structural transformation of the public sphere. As it is well known, Habermas argued that the entanglement of the public and the private, state and society in the 19th century led to a refeudalization of society, culminating in the destruction of the bourgeois public sphere, a space of critical and open exchange. So we can read what I'm trying to argue as an inversion of Habermas, if you want. So what I try to argue is that the ever greater entanglement between public and private brought about by neoliberal processes of privatization since the late 20th century leads to a refeudalization of the state itself, not of society, that is a collapse between public reasons of office and private loyalties, between office and contract, which undermine the very rationale that justifies the existence of the modern state to begin with. And this fact in turn, I think, illuminates, or at least I hope, an important contradiction that is internal to neoliberalism itself. So as an ideology, neoliberalism advocates a restoration of liberalism and an era of limited government. But as a practice of governance, neoliberalism delivers exactly the opposite, a renewed feudal order within which political power is increasingly exercised on the basis of private reasons and private loyalties and unilateral determinations. So neoliberalism, in this sense, we may say, is inherently illiberal insofar as it violates a central tenet of arguably any kind of liberalism, which is the obvious and yet crucial idea that political power ought to be exercised for public purposes alone. So what would the exit from the privatized state requires in practice? How much time do I have? 5 minutes? 3 minutes? 5 minutes? Sorry, I didn't. Yeah.
You can take 5 minutes. Yeah.
So I'm here moving to the concluding part, both of the talk and the book, which is what would the exit from the privatized state requires in practice? And here by exit, I mean not a major structural change, but something that it's perhaps within the scope of something that we can imagine or hope for, although these days it's hard to hope for any kind of transformation of these kinds. But anyway, negatively, I defend certain constitutional limits to privatization, but more positively, I try to dialectically use the critique of privatization, as just mentioned, as a starting point for building a more democratic model of public administration. And what I propose or I suggest specifically is a model of administrative co-determination. So the basic idea is that on the one hand, the substantive demands of Kantian legitimacy require an independent, partly insulated bureaucracy which can resist partisan pressures, especially when this pressure contradicts constitutional essential, etc., etc. But on the other hand, however, the procedural demands of legitimacy require democratic control over exercises of administrative discretion that cannot and should not be eliminated through top-down control. So once again, here we encounter the threat of subjection to the quasi-legislative and merely unilateral will of others, but these times of public administrators themselves. And I argue that the most promising way of overcoming this threat and reconciling the procedural and the substantive demands of legitimacy is through a system of co-determination, whereby citizens and bureaucrats share in the responsibility of making together, of co-determining certain administrative decisions. So in practice, co-determination means, for example, that decentralized administrative agency, as well as local agencies empowered to regulate street-level bureaucracies, should be managed by boards of directors, including both meritocratically appointed and partly insulated civil servants and randomly selected citizens on the model of citizens' jury. So while civil servants retain the responsibility of designing regulations, citizen jury could be given the power to block proposed regulations that are judged to fail to take into account relevant considerations that have emerged through, for example, a process of public hearings. So a system of administrative co-determination, I think to here paraphrase Weber, would reconcile the demands of democracy and bureaucracy by making some, but not all administrative offices universally accessible through lotteries, while at the same time also making the legitimacy of public officials' authority partially, but not entirely dependent on the influence of public opinions as it emerges from a practice of public hearings. So this was just a sketch. I'll stop here. I've tried as best as I could to provide a general overview of the book. Now I want to stress the fact that 5 years have passed from its publication. These are also very different political circumstances. So I'm particularly glad of this opportunity to rethink about the book, but also about its limits. Perhaps as a, I might sound like I'm putting my hands to protect myself, but I think thinking about the book, the most important limit in my own view was that it really does not clearly situate the problem of the privatized state within a broader theory of capitalism. And this has prompted my current project, which focuses precisely on normative critiques of capitalism, which is what I'm working at the moment. But I'm sure there are many other limits that will emerge during the conversation. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Chiara, and for a very good summary of your position. And now we move to Professor Nadia Urbinati.
Thank you all. Thank you, Dilip, for this invitation, and Chiara for writing this splendid book, according to me. How many minutes do I have? 10 minutes?
Oh, you have what, 12 minutes?
12 minutes, good. So since the book is already written, I cannot simply go through the book itself, but to the problems that this book proposes, so that if Chiara is going to work on it, on capitalism in relation to this book, can be of some usefulness. So first of all, I have a few points actually and some reflection. The first one has to do with the periodization. I am more than she is convinced, or Chiara is convinced, that the evolution or the devolution of the states into privatized states started before and it started after World War II. There was a long project that had to do, in my view, and there are historical reconstructive books that can help us to see it. The problem of reconstructing democracy after World War II has been conceived also in view of containing the democratic element and thus containing also the presence of the state in society. So there was, since the beginning of the reconstruction of democracy, a preoccupation with containing the states and expanding the private dimension for reconstructing the society, for reconstructing the services, and thus also to revise the conception of welfare social states, giving the states less function in the services and more function in the regulation. So this was a long process that started before, although we see the consequences of it only late to the century, until the end of the century. This is my first observation. The second observation has to do with the democratic theory itself. You said already in your presentation, I'd like to stress again that the issue of actual government, policy making, administrations is a kind of Cinderella of political theory, because it's considered to be this sector of intervention by the states that is the less exposed to democratic decision making, because structurally based inside of bureaucracy and so on and so forth. And I think that democratic theory had a responsibility in that, because it always was very much concerned with the formation of opinion, the formation of movements outside of the institutions, and the lawmaking moments inside of the states, considering the states kind of disturbance sometimes, and other times a subject of repression and coercion, and thus also an object of mistrust somehow. So the relationship between state and democracy, or the theory of the state and the theory of democracy, is not been, in my view at least, a very friendly one for many decades. Third element that I like to stress or to ask, this is a question to you. So in your book and also in your presentation somehow, I see a conflation between states and democratic states. I would like to understand whether the issue of privatization that you so effectively show, privatization of the states, is the privatization of the states or is the privatization of democratic states? For me, are not the same thing. And I think that the state is something to be considered somehow autonomous. I know that this can be an object of contestation, but I do think that democracy and the democratic states are not the same thing. So may I ask a question, whether in my view at least, the privatization is even more radical, because it's not simply privatization in relation to the democratic states, but radically to the states. As you said at the end, this kind of refeudalization of public relations among citizens, and thus the introduction of domination, that is a form of despotic power that is not political, that belongs to a non-public or non-state actorship. So these are my three observations. Then I'd like to enter in the topic of the book, and in particular, ask some delucidation or even questions, if you like, that focuses on one issue in particular, which interests me also because of my personal competence, which is the question of representation. So I really enjoyed very much your chapter on part of representation, the problem of representative agency. And I'd like to ask you a question because for me are very important. So you show very convincingly that we cannot use the paradigm of mandate representations, these agent-actor relationship, and we need to understand instead representation from the point of view of the intention, right? So not simply acting according to the rules or acting in relation to the authorizations or complying with the rules coming from that authorizations, but also according to the intention. The intention is very important because it has to do, the intended motivation for action has to do with the character of the actor or the action itself. It's not public, it's private, thus the intention is to accumulate, to have income and profit, and not to take care of the interest of the other. So the intention, in my view, thus, it seems to me that this is, you are very much Hegelian here more than Kantian. You are looking for the ethos. You are looking for forming the ethos and the intention that is the good character of the actor, who is able to act, although private, to act by taking into account, not taking into account, but acting as if he were a public, although he operates in the private. So this is much more than rules of the games, or even much more, in my view, also of Kant, because you go to the intention and not simply to action. I like it very much, but then you need to change something, perhaps in your view, which is nothing important. Radical is important, which implies, and perhaps I'm wrong, that your model of representation is not certainly the one by mandate according to the classical tradition we know about, but it reminds me of the kind of representation that Rousseau would use when he spoke about imperative mandate. That is, you cannot delegate. You cannot delegate. You have to use the agents as a servant of the sovereign if you want to keep the agent acting with the intention of the sovereign. So you don't give the will up, you give simply the judgment on what to do. But then when the will has to be put into action, you have to go back to the actor and ask for the permission. So this reminds me of imperative mandate. And if this is the case, I think that there are no many chances. I mean, you cannot accommodate very much the public and the private, because the private is, in this case, is another name for the public with other means, but it's always the public, because this is exactly the logic of imperative mandate, which is direct democracy, used to be direct democracy by other means. So applied to your case, it is public action with other means, but is always public. So it is a way of extending the public by transforming the privates as a kind of sub-agency of the public. This would be the way of introducing the intention within the domain of representation. So the last question, I don't want to abuse, has to do with the reconfiguring the public. That is your proposals, the final part of the book, which is extremely interesting. And you give us two sets of proposals, one pertaining to the formation of the bureaucracy of the public actors, education, informations, and again, the ethical moment comes back again. It reminds us, of course, of the universal class of Hegel. This is what the bureaucracy is another. Is not private. It's something that needs to have its own ethos, its own formation, because it is in the service of the state, not necessarily the democratic state. This is one proposal. The other proposal is to do with the role of the citizens. And the role of the citizens, you have two possibilities, two connected solutions. One, by creating these citizen juries through sortition. And the other one by giving them the veto power, use the word veto also, not simply consulting or surveying, but also veto power. So with a lot of power of containing, not simply giving surveillance or stimuli. Now, I think that if, and only if, these citizen juries don't have a say in lawmaking, I would agree with you. That is a good way to go. But then you say that the administration has to do with lawmaking. So you say that we are not simply talking of division between government and administrative power and the lawmaking, because in fact, by administering, you're also participating in implementing and making legislation. So in this case, these citizen jury, without perhaps the intention, they enter into the domain of lawmaking somehow. So I would agree with sortition and citizen jury in the domain of surveying and even veto somehow, because they have the power of judging impartially, that is according to the perspective of the point of view of the state. So it makes a lot of sense that they do so. But I need to understand better the relationship, because you said also in the presentation, the relationship between administrative power and lawmaking and legislative power. You said at the beginning, so the separation, okay, generally we have between the classical idea that we have the separation between administrative or and executive and the legislative needs to be revised, because in fact everything can be legislative. So thank you very much. I stop here because I would otherwise I would abuse. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. And now we move on to Blake Emerson. Blake, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Dilip and Chiara for inviting me to discuss this great book. My background is in administrative law as well as political theory. So I'm going to focus on some of the great points of interest from a public law perspective that this book brings up. The privatized state is undoubtedly a major contribution not only to contemporary political philosophy but also to public law. And while Cordelli's ultimate concern is to identify the deep normative problems with the privatization of government, on the way she develops an affirmative case for a democratically legitimated administrative state. In my remarks, I want to focus on the points of interest for public law, and I want to ask in particular about the role of the courts, of the president or of another chief executive, if we're talking about other countries, as well as the role of the civil service. I was struck in reading the book the degree of convergence between my own thinking on the administrative state and Cordelli's, which she communicates with much higher degree of analytical precision and persuasiveness than I could. Whereas Cordelli's approach is normative and analytic, mine in the public's law was much more historical and institutional, examining how Hegel influenced American thinkers like Dewey and Du Bois, who in turn influenced the configuration of New Deal agencies in the United States. It's particularly striking that in two books published only a few years apart, we have, without reading one another, each landed on common solutions to the problem of reconciling democratic legitimacy and bureaucratic power. Each of the books emphasized the value of a Hegelian professional ethos among the public service, as well as the necessity of deep public participation in administrative decision-making. Perhaps this is an example of wisdom only taking flight when the shades of night are gathering, or maybe more optimistically, history is working behind our backs to provide an agenda for future democratic renewal. Cordelli identifies the tension between the apparent need for administrative institutions to meet the material demands of equal freedom on the one hand, and the risk of coercion and alienation that arises when officials not directly accountable to the public alter the rights and obligations of people subject to their authority on the other. And today, the American public is subject to one extreme of this tension at the expense of the other, as elected officials uproot agencies that provide basic public services and regulatory functions. Cordelli's integrative solution to this problem of bureaucratic necessity and democratic risk is complex but convincing. To summarize, administrative authority must be authorized by a majoritarian will that takes the form of legislation, must be representative of that will in the sense of having the right intentional orientation towards it, has to respect the relevant constitutional essentials, including, I think, a fairly expansive conception of the material requisites for democratic participation, and must also be informed by direct public participation in administrative decision-making, not just at the policy-making level, but also apparently at the street level. In the absence of these conditions, or to the extent that they are not present, the state is democratically illegitimate. This theory is quite demanding, and I do wonder whether it could ever really be achieved. To be fair to Cordelli's analysis, she rightly sees legitimacy in shades of gray, not as black or white. But I myself have been worrying about whether the conditions for a legitimate administrative state are so complex and demanding that they can only be achieved in rare historical configurations that are unlikely to be recreated if they ever existed in the first place. And to my own mind, I think of, perhaps the mid-1970s was perhaps the moment where the American administrative state came anywhere close to a vision like the one that Cordelli advances. Cordelli goes on to show convincingly that broad and systemic delegation of governmental functions to private contractors creates a much greater risk of undemocratic, unilateral decision-making than does a properly constituted administrative state. Of particular interest in this regard is Cordelli's original defense of the non-delegation doctrine. The non-delegation doctrine, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a rule of American constitutional law, which some other countries, like Germany, also share. It provides that the legislature may not delegate its legislative task to other actors. Until recently, this doctrine was rarely enforced in US law due to the risk it might deeply impair regulatory functions. It's actually only been used to invalidate legislation 3 times, all during 2 years during the New Deal. Cordelli argues for a version of the non-delegation doctrine that is grounded in what she calls the, quote, principle of collective non-alienation, namely that a democratic government lacks the moral authority to pass either laws or policies that amount to an abdication of its citizens' basic capacity for self-rule, unquote. Systems that disable directive control, oversight capacity, and equal opportunities for citizen influence thus affect a delegation of the legislative power in the sense of alienating collective democratic rights. While the administrative state surely carries this risk, especially in the absence of effective public participation, the privatization of governmental functions magnifies this risk extraordinarily. The problem is not necessarily the risk created by any particular delegation of a governmental function, but that the aggregate delegation of many legislative tasks results in the systemic self-abnegation of democratic will overall. This argument about non-delegation leads into the first of my observations and questions motivated by recent concerns in American public law. While the Supreme Court has not yet revived the non-delegation doctrine, although it may do so this term, there's a case that involves the major questions doctrine in front of the Supreme Court this spring. In the meantime, the Supreme Court has developed a doctrine of statutory interpretation called the major questions doctrine, and which is closely analogous to and clearly grounded upon the non-delegation doctrine that Cordelli focuses on. The major questions doctrine provides that administrative bodies can only take actions of, quote, vast economic and political significance if the statute that authorizes the agency explicitly gives them the power to take that action. For instance, the court prevented the Department of Labor in the United States from imposing a vaccine or testing mandate on employers with over 100 employees during the COVID-19 pandemic because the authorizing statute did not mention vaccines specifically, even though it referred to public health in general or the safety of the workers. Now, I suspect that this kind of application of the non-delegation doctrine would be unsupported in Cordelli's theory, as it likely impairs agencies from protecting certain substantive rights, such as basic bodily security that are necessary to equal freedom. It also impairs the capacity of administrative agencies to engage in extensive public participation and deliberation if they cannot settle major questions that aren't resolved by the statute itself. Moreover, the whole reason administrative delegation is often necessary is because many major problems and solutions cannot possibly be precisely identified and defined ex ante. So I wonder if that characterization of the problem with the major questions doctrine in Cordelli's view is correct. Or by contrast, is there something to the view that certain kinds of administrative actions, at least those that may impact fundamental or constitutional rights, require clear and explicit legislative authorization? The broader problem that this specific doctrinal question raises is that a theory that combines multiple dimensions of legitimation, from democratic authorization to representative agency to public participation, creates the difficulty of determining how to balance, integrate, or square these dimensions in relation to one another. Is the relative degree of weight we should give to specific statutory authorizations versus fiduciary responsibility versus participation purely empirical or contextual? Or are there mid-level normative principles that could help us to adjudicate the tensions among them? A related problem here is the role of the judiciary in Cordelli's analysis. In Kant's view, I think, courts in public law disputes would play the relatively narrow role of publicly determining whether an executive action is within the bounds of the legislative will. Over time, however, liberal constitutionalism has envisioned a more comprehensive role for courts, including John Rawls's view that the US Supreme Court is, quote, an exemplar of public reason. Few would contest that the US courts today have what Cordelli would call a legislative role, insofar as they are capable of altering the normative situation of people subject to their authority in a general way. But as the major questions doctrine and other developments in US public law suggest, there is a serious risk, if not reality, of judicial aggrandizement, where the courts usurp power from other constitutional actors. In my view, the US Supreme Court has made it exceedingly difficult for administrative agencies to play their essential democratic functions by inhibiting their ability to make policy and to adjudicate the rights of private parties. This is not the result of any one decision, but a set of doctrines that deprive agencies of specific binding powers and continuously cast shade on their constitutional legitimacy. I wonder whether Cordelli's vision of democratic constitutionalism carries any lessons for the role of courts in relation to administrative agencies. Whereas the courts are present but mostly peripheral to Cordelli's analysis, the president, or the chief executive, seems to play no meaningful role. And I don't mean this as a critique, because the book can only do so much, and this is not really the orientation of her analysis, but I want to invite further reflection on this question in the present moment, because I do think that Cordelli's analysis does shed light on it. Would Cordelli see the president as simply another source of electoral democratic legitimacy, or as posing a much more acute risk of a private unilateral will than does the legislature? The Trump administration shows in an extreme form how a kind of private state can exist even in the absence of explicit privatization. And that's true, particularly given Cordelli's view that one of the requirements of democratic legitimacy is to have the correct intentional orientation towards the omnilateral will, which Trump surely lacks. The Trump administration shows in an extreme form how a single official can act not for public purposes, but according to their own private will and interest. Trump has fired tens of thousands of civil servants, attempted to destroy entire agencies, and imprisoned people abroad. In many cases, these actions are clearly unlawful, and Cordelli's theory could easily address them that way. Even though its recent events suggest that judicial remedies are woefully insufficient to address an arbitrary chief executive. Perhaps there is a deeper problem here, not just with illegality, but with the hierarchical structure of the executive and of the administrative system, or at least that system within a unitary theory of the executive that has recently become dominant in US constitutional law. According to this theory, the president alone exercises the executive power, and thus must be able to control and to fire all other executive officers. On its face, this seems like a problem of private unilateral will, as the name unitary suggests, at least where the president is not reliably guided by legal or other public purposes. So is it right to think of presidential control in analogy to a private delegation, given all the ways that the president, despite his electoral legitimacy, may elude democratic control or fiduciary responsibility or egalitarian accountability? Or are the problems surrounding executive power distinctive? Perhaps presidentialism and privatization are inverse aspects of the same sort of problem. The privatized state Cordelli is concerned with involves numerous discrete delegations to multiple non-state decision makers, which, through a broad diffusion of unaccountable decisional power, together alienate democratic control. The narrowing of political authority and conflict to the presidency, by contrast, seems to involve the consolidation of power at one point in the Oval Office. While the office is nominally public, there is little inherent guarantee in our system that the president will exercise the office for public purposes. Moreover, the condensation of power in the presidency and the dispersion to private actors may be mutually reinforcing dynamics. And this is an argument that my colleague John Michaels has made, and this is a figure who is quite useful in Cordelli's analysis in the book. John makes the argument that privatization enhances the authority of political actors because they can exercise more coercive arbitrary power over the contractor, because a contractor, unlike a civil servant, is not protected against removal for political reasons. So privatization doesn't just enhance the power of the private party, it enhances the power of the political actors at the top of the hierarchy, at the expense of law and at the expense of the impartiality of the civil service. Finally, to conclude on our shared Hegelian note, the vision of official ethos Cordelli has in mind is constituted by an institutional rationality that officials occupy within a healthy constitutional order. In a healthy constitutional state, such as existed in the US perhaps in the last quarter of the 20th century, civil servants would be imbued with public-spirited virtues, habits, and ways of reasoning that were publicly responsive, oriented towards law, constitutionally grounded, professionally conscientious, and technically competent. And I do want to underscore here just the real value of American civil service ethos as it existed and as it is currently being destroyed. It was a real asset to our constitutional system that is now being taken apart, not just piece by piece, but wholesale. So what do officials do if we are not at the end of history, but in its middle, and civil servants are being arbitrarily removed from their posts in service of authoritarianism or even fascism? Is there a version of the administrative ethic appropriate to the kind of life and death struggle that we are seeing in government now? What would a universal class for times of crisis look like? And what would be the role of scholars and citizens in protecting it? Thanks.
Thank you, Blake. So we move to our final respondent, Leah Downey.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dilip, for organizing this and for the invitation, and to Chiara, of course, for the book. I'm really honored to be discussing it, particularly as a part of this panel. The privatized state, I think, offers, I mean, unsurprisingly, just a very careful, in-depth, and compelling analysis of the privatization of government. In it, Cordelli tackles a wide variety of questions, including those as bold and fundamental as what are political institutions for? A question that is, as has already been emphasized, of particular relevance and interest today. The book, of course, focuses on privatization, which have obvious resonances, but it also offers a wide-ranging discussion and analysis that can be applied to democratic delegation more broadly, and I've found that particularly ripe for thought in a contemporary context amidst political turmoil about independent agencies as well, such as the Fed and the FTC, and ongoing court cases about their legitimacy and constitutionality as well. And I wonder what Chiara thinks about this, as the book doesn't explicitly go into independent agencies in the administrative state as much, but it does engage, of course, at length with the literature on legitimate delegation. And so I just wonder her thoughts on if delegation to agencies, particularly independent agencies that are heavily embedded with private interests, are distinct in her view. But moving on quickly, I'm going to try and sort of hit 3 points in my comments today. The first is that I really want to emphasize Cordelli's contribution to democratic theory broadly. And second, I want to ask her a question about her critique of privatization in the aggregate and the focus on thresholds in the book. And then last, discuss a bit her view on legitimacy and her sort of related suggestion or solution to the threat of privatization. So first, Cordelli emphasizes over and over, and very correctly, I think, that she sees the issue with privatization as not just about any given single choice about what to privatize or on what conditions, which is the focus of a lot of the literature, but rather about what privatization as a general trend does to government. And this is where she gets this concept of a transformation, and in particular, why she doesn't always put it this way. As I read her, it's really about a transformation and a shift in power. So she does discuss this idea of neo-Republicans being concerned with the centralization of power, whereas she seems to be more concerned, as Blake kind of was just mentioning, with an overly decentralization of power. And in general, I see Cordelli as sort of ringing alarm bells about the waning power of the state in a way. And I do think that that's quite a useful correction to much of political theory over the last few decades. She makes the very obvious and correct point that too much privatization will, of course, undermine the capacity of the state over time. We just won't have the people to do the things that we want to do as a state. But also the more subtle point that it undermines the power of the state in general, as the farther we delegate, the harder it becomes to reassert power. And in this way, Chiara ends up making a point about the very nature of political action itself. So starting from this commitment to individual freedom, observing a sort of necessary social interaction, and then from that drawing a requirement for the collective right to democratic self-rule. And this is what the general trend of privatization, as she sees it, undermines. So as she puts it, the ultimate wrong of privatization is the creation of an institutional arrangement that denies those subject to it equal freedom, understood as a relationship of reciprocal independence. It essentially undermines our capacity to act together. Cordelli writes, quote, "It undoes the very rationale that justifies and compels the existence of political and democratic institutions in the first place." In the book, Cordelli develops a theory of democracy that doesn't necessarily fit into much of contemporary literature, in my view, which I wonder if Chiara agrees, but it's part of what I see as a small but growing and extremely compelling literature on democracy that seeks to recenter the importance of collective autonomy and agency in how we think about democracy. Her focus on collective self-rule and its connection to freedom pushes forward an image of politics that goes beyond merely distribution, but instead is about our shared capacity or powers. And I think that's very welcome in the political theory literature, whether you adopt the Kantian framing that Cordelli offers or not. So my second point is I just want to ask her a bit more about her focus on aggregate privatization. Her point is that, and it's very well taken, that even if each decision to privatize a particular office or agency or power was legitimate, if they pass a certain threshold, too much privatization can undermine the very point of government. My questions here are somewhat practical. So the ideas of a threshold and an aggregate, of course, imply quantification. But what exactly is it that we're quantifying? The numbers of powers that are privatized, the number of offices, the number of agencies. And while I totally sympathize with this effort to move beyond asserting that certain powers are essentially private or essentially public, if we're in the business of quantifying, is the privatization of monetary power or military power really the same as the privatization of the traffic officer? And then lastly, and sort of most substantively, I really want to talk about Cordelli's discussion of legitimacy, which is really closely tied to her proposed solutions. So Cordelli suggests there are essentially three ways to secure or contribute to the legitimacy of the exercise powers. And these are not mutually exclusive, of course, as her solution suggests. There's a kind of top-down approach, a fiduciary approach, and a more bottom-up approach. Each, on Cordelli's view, has its own failings. And in the end, her suggestion is that it's really a combination of all three of these that can secure the desired outcome, something that Blake mentioned in his discussion. So ultimately, Cordelli wants a tighter relationship between democracy and bureaucracy, as she mentioned in her comments, and she sees that as coming through establishing lawmaking as a shared cooperative activity. I really agree with this, and she makes very compelling arguments for it. However, her answer to achieving it is to utilize and combine these three forms of legitimation, and I want to push her a little bit on that and see what she thinks. So just to consider all three of them sort of in order, she talks about participation, this sort of bottom-up form of legitimation in the form of citizens' juries, as we've already discussed. And as Cordelli recognizes in the text, if these are purely advisory, then they're insufficient to secure a certain form of collective control over policy that she wants to establish. And if they're voluntary, they tend to favor those with the time and interest to give. And which is why we see her proposing a veto power for these juries. But what she doesn't emphasize, and what I think is really difficult for such an approach, is that it runs immediately into what I see as the problematic question of demographic representation. So why is a statistically representative body better at articulating my interests than a representative that I choose, just because I happen to share certain demographic characteristics with the jury? And more importantly, for Chiara's view in particular, whose theory, in my view, of democracy rightly emphasizes agency, power, and control, how does a body like this, based on statistical representation, not agency, contribute to democracy understood in that way? So it's hard for me to see how it would contribute to the formation of an omnilateral will in a meaningful sense. But I'm going to leave that, especially because Professor Urbinati has literally just written the book on exactly these topics. When it comes to the fiduciary approach, this is, of course, the view that policymakers should be fiduciaries of the public good, acting in the public interest as they understand it. And Cordelli is exactly right that it's a particularly attractive approach to legitimation because it enables desirable degrees of discretion for the policymakers, right? So enabling the experts to sort of do their thing and engage in creativity in making policy, which I also agree is extremely desirable. What I'm not sure about is why the fiduciary approach is necessary to securing this. So this relates to Cordelli's own critique of the fiduciary approach, which is this observation that citizens shouldn't be treated like children, right? That the fiduciary approach on its own can produce a sort of paternalistic account. And to that, I want to reply with the difference between a babysitter, thinking about the difference between a babysitter and a piano teacher, right? So a babysitter we might think of as a straightforward representative in sort of Pitkin's kind of sense of making present, where they're exercising paternal power in the absence of a parent. Whereas a piano teacher is quite different, right? They're deploying their own expertise. They're empowered by the parent still, so they derive their power from the parent, but to teach the child, right? They're not actually replacing the parent or making them present in any direct sense. So in my view, a fiduciary is acting more like a babysitter, but what if we could utilize expertise and allow for discretion in a form more like a piano teacher? And I think this is somewhat related to Professor Urbinati's reference to Rousseau. So that brings us to this last form of legitimation, which is the top-down form that Cordelli describes this form in line with most of the literature as aiming to reduce or minimize discretion through directive control. The point she suggests is to track the will of the people or the majority through directive control by elected officials. Cordelli writes that discretion on this view is legitimate only if its exercise is forced to track the will of the people, understood as the will of the majority, and the only way of achieving this outcome is through almost unqualified directive control of bureaucrats' actions by elected officials. But on my view, it seems to me that to require popular control is not necessarily to require that policy tracks some existing will of the people. Cordelli elsewhere in the book emphasizes that the process of policymaking actually constitutes the will of the people, and any such will doesn't necessarily pre-exist the process itself, which I completely agree with. But then it seems to me that is it not the case that what's of concern here is actually preserving the power of the citizens or through their elected officials to exercise collective self-rule and maintain power over time, but not actually to track some sort of articulated will that requires the type of direction from the quote above. In which case, the top-down approach to legitimation, sort of properly construed, if you will, is not focused on directive control, but in preserving the power of citizens or elected officials over time. And that's exactly what's needed to secure the approach to policymaking that respects individual freedom via collective self-rule that Cordelli is, in my view, correctly seeking. In other words, what's required is not complete legislative direction of all administrative and private actions, but a maintenance of legislative control over the process. So if that were correct, then there are some consequences, it seems to me, for Cordelli's proposed solution. Even if they all are part of a cooperative process, and by all I mean here private agents, administrative agents, citizens' juries, elected officials, etc., it seems to me on this view, they shouldn't all be equal partners in that process, which relates to one of Professor Emerson's questions. So on this view, discretion would be permitted, even encouraged, so long as it's under the active management of elected officials. To determine whether privatization was legitimate, one would focus not on identifying a quantitative threshold, but rather asking, does the legislature retain effective power over the policymaking process? So just to conclude, I want to say that this book is such a massive contribution. It's been hugely helpful in my own thinking, and it's a huge contribution to democratic theory in its own right, pushing forward this growing literature that's aiming to center agency and power and collective rule and theories of democracy, as well as to a burgeoning literature in political theory on the state and institutions. As we've already heard, it just takes very seriously the way that the world actually works today and uses that to push forward political theory. It's worth reading, no matter if you're concerned with the privatized state or with technocracy and bureaucracy, or just interested in how democracy centered on power could be instantiated in practice. So thank you very much to Chiara for writing it. And I look forward to hearing your response.
Here we go, Chiara. You got 3 very, very impressive responses and many, many questions raised. So you have 10 minutes to answer all that, or 12 minutes to answer.
Oh, wow. I'll do my so I'll start. Thank you so much. I mean, this incredible set of comments spanning a wide variety of topics. I won't be able, of course, to do justice to all of them. Let me start. I'll pick one to make sure I answer the first share of question, and then I'll come back to more if there is time. So I want to start with Nadia's question about representation. Of course, it comes from one of the most important scholars on representation, and her argument here, to put it very simply, and it's like, are you more Kantian or more Hegelian? Because when you define your concept of representation, what it means to represent a public will, we might think for Kantians, and Arthur Ripstein, for example, has explicitly defended the view what it takes for an office holders to act in a representative capacity is simply to act within the boundaries of the mandate. And I criticize that view and argue that instead what it means to represent is to act. I mean, the intention is important, but what matters most are the kind of considerations that underpin the judgment of the representative. The representative needs to make a decision to deliberate on the basis of considerations that are not excluded from a mandate, the nature of which is public. And I think some considerations that private actors must act on are necessarily excluded by the nature, by the occupancy of a public role. So this creates, Nadia is perfectly right, a very important tension between, because what I argue then is that in order to this representation to happen, in order for public officials to be successful as opposed to failed representatives, the ethos, the bureaucratic ethos, it's all important because it's the ethos that support the official's capacity to act in accordance with the appropriate kind of considerations. And of course, this would seem to introduce a subjective element in a Kantian theory that otherwise would seem to be focused on external freedoms, rules, mandates, and is very objectivist. But that was precisely my intention. This is it's not an orthodox Kantian theory. It's a Kant-inspired theory, and where Kant does not, in my view, achieve, does not provide the right sort of principle is complemented, hopefully in a coherent way, with other sources. As in this case, it's true, there is an Hegelian element, but how is this Hegelian element of the subjective ethos reconciled, right, in a way that is not incoherent with the normative Kantian framework? And the idea is that the ethos itself is institutional. So the ethos is not just a subjectivist element, but the ethos is what emerges from the appropriate constitution of office. How is an office appropriately constituted? Well, it has to be regulated through a principle of stewards. Office holders need not to have discretionary property. They must be insulated through tenure protection. They must be socialized through a particular kind of educations, and so it's an institutional ethos. What ultimately we need to look at when we assess the legitimacy of an administrative state. So the Hegelian element is in this sense not a subjectivist element, but I think, and this is why when the office holders act in accordance to the ethos, it does not act according to a private unilateral will, but it acts according to the spirit of the institutions. Let me then turn into Blake. So here maybe I can join 2 points very quickly. One is I completely agree about the risk of judicial aggrandizement. I don't say much about the court. I take it that one possible reading of the implication of my normative argument is potentially a defense of the Chevron principle, that the doctrine that this court has overruled recently. So the idea is that the principle granted some judicial deference to administrative agency. Administrative agency retained the right to interpret statutes that were ambiguous. Recently, the court has appealed to what actually might seem something like the argument of my book, like we need to be more faithful to the will of the legislator, and so courts should be less differential. But as many commentators have pointed out, that means simply that the discretion moves to judges, and now judges' discretion is aggrandized, whereas I think my argument points to the view that judicial deference is compatible with the democratic rationale, because the democratic will must be represented within the executive itself. And so the courts can continue in that sense to be, within certain limits, differential. And similar on the president, I agree with Blake. I'm very interested in this topic because Italy, my own country, is trying to move to a very bizarre system which is not fully president, but they would accentuate power in the executive. So I think here the most obvious risk is the one of despotism. And I completely agree that the president, because in order to avoid the risk of despotism, a nominal separation of power and respect for constitutional essentials are not sufficient guarantee to make the will of the president representative, because in order to avoid sectarianism, you would also have to have, as I mentioned earlier, socialization within, for example, a certain kind of public ethos, and a form also of deliberations organized in a particular way that is necessary for a public will to emerge. Now, executive orders are not deliberative decision in this way. The president is there for a few years, is not socialized in any mechanism that can develop the bureaucratic ethos. And so there are, and as you mentioned, Blake, there is also the fact that the president is like much less constrained than other actors. And so I completely agree with you that in this respect, presidentialism raises question of despotism that are similar to the one of privatization. I would, however, say that at a theory level, the office of the president is an office, is not a contractual arrangement. The president takes an oath, and the president has the only obligation to act for public purposes. So what we see is a corruption, a likely one, but a corruption of what should be a public office. In privatization, there is nothing of this. Private actors must act for private goals because of their dualism, and they must, they must not take a duty of office because they are contractual actors. Their obligations are contractually, voluntarily, privately agreed with the state, as opposed to, deriving from a duty of loyalty. And so there are, in principle, differences between the presidents and private actors, which I think still make the case of privatization theoretically pure in a way that presidentialism is not. Turning now to Leah. So let me say something about how I think about the threshold question. My argument there is that traditional arguments for non-delegation, from Kent and Bracton jurists' argument, legislative power cannot be delegated because the king does not own the rights of citizens, and so that power cannot be delegated because it's not owned by the sovereign, to other more Lockean arguments that the legislature cannot delegate lawmaking power because that power is entrusted or contractually agreed to stay with the legislator. I argue that all those arguments do not work to justify a principle of non-delegation, but that there is this other rationale for thinking that sometimes, the forms of power should not be delegated to other actors, which is this aggregative rationale, the fact that certain delegation in aggregate can ultimately abdicate the conditions of democratic self-rule. And so there is an obvious problem of the threshold. How do we know when enough delegations have happened? And you mentioned, well, is the traffic controller the same as delegating financial regulation? And my question is yes or no. So the answer comes from how we understand the precondition of democratic self-rule. One important precondition, and perhaps less obvious, which also I think Hegel himself makes this point, is that if the citizens stop seeing the state as the entity that provides for their own needs, they stop caring about the state, they stop having reasons to support the state, and the state will be close to ruin. And so there are services that might seem trivial to us, or where privatization would seem like welfare delivery or healthcare provision, where maybe the funding remains with the state. So it seems that you just privatize the provision, it's not a problem. but it actually, and so maybe traffic control, I don't know, maybe it's not so important, but that are important for maintaining this affective attachment and so civic vigilance. So when thinking about the threshold, you have to think, one question is, how much interaction with political institutions are citizens able to retain? And similarly, I think another question, which is not quantitative, but is all qualitative, is what kind of discretion is delegated through different kind of privatization? Because some forms of discretion may be kind of discretion we want citizens to have an equal share of control. Maybe other forms of discretion as indifferent, like whether to pick up the trash with yellow bag or blue bags, right? Those are in different kinds of discretion for democracy. And so what kind of discretion is delegated through different kind of privatization is also important in thinking about that threshold. And finally, what kind of delegations make the state dependent and subject to exploitations by private actors? And there, for example, services that might not be so important for the affective attachment to citizens, such as IT, like technologies. I mean, think about now AI, make the state entirely dependent. And so, the private actors then have the power, of course, of asking all sorts of concessions, and that also may vary service by service in that respect. So that's my broad answer to the threshold question. I should probably stop here and leave space for the Q&A.
Thank you, Chiara. So we are now open for comments from Nadia, Blake, and Leah. We can, before we turn to the public, if you have any question from the public, we'll get from the audience.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead, Nadia.
Okay, so thank you. Yeah, I understand your point on the question of ethos or no, that is not subjective. It's connected to the role in the institutions at the states. But this means the spirit of the institutions that this means that a classical procedural definition of democracy we are connected to and we are related to is not enough. We really need to have a conception of democracy, leaving aside the states. I don't want, is another story, I know. That it's, Blake mentioned Dewey, that is attentive to the formation of the ethos of the service to the states and the citizens. So it is a request. You put an important problem on the floor, because it is a request of revising the classical theory or the minimalist of the procedural theory of democracy we rely upon, because otherwise you don't have this possibility. In my view, this is very important what you are doing, because you open the floor to this integration. And finally, I do really think that state and democracy, after all, are separate, because to democratize the state, one may think that it means also to expand the political will influence over the institutions. A democratic conception of the state may also imply, for some, that the central bank should be under the will of the people, like other institutions. But you want to separate instead and to protect those state institutions from this will of the people, which is based on parties, on partisanship, on majority will. So still, I think the two are different. State and democracy are still, well, okay.
May I respond to this quickly? Yeah. So
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if I would put it in a sharp separation between state and the democratic state. So in terms of the argument of the book and how I see the relationships, right? The Kantian argument, which starts to introduce the problem of domination unilateralism, may seem to apply to just a fundamental system of rules, which is how a lot of political theories, a public system of rules, understand the state, right? The state is a very abstract notion. It doesn't, and in that sense, I defend, I mean, the argument, the democratization of the system of rules. So if you will, the constituent moment, at the constitutional level, the fundamental laws, right, have to be democratically authorized. But then the idea is that you cannot stop there, in part because these fundamental laws are not enough to legitimize subsequent form of lawmaking, and also because the same reason why we might have to democratize fundamental laws are also reasons to democratize lower level of government. And in some sense, this way I arrive to street-level bureaucrats. So in this respect, I do not want to separate the state from the democratic state, because I think the rationale to democratize the fundamental system of rules and to democratize part of the street-level bureaucracy are similar and the same, and in some sense, the latter are justified by showing the limits of pure proceduralist rule at the top, right? But I agree with you that I do not want to democratize everything, but that's not the state, that's not the state, non-state distinction or sovereignty and government or state, depending on how you understand the distinction. It's more the fact that I think the omnilateral will, the democrat, has itself many components, many requirements, right? So we need, right, respect for the Constitution. You need non-sectarianism, public orientation, and so not all these desiderata or constituent of an omnilateral will can be achieved through direct democratization. So sometimes you need certain forms of insulation and more accent on fiduciary relations. Other times you need more direct democratization to fulfill these demands of legitimacy. So in that sense, on the central banks, since this is a question that both Nadia and Leah asked me, I mean, I don't have a full theory of central bank. What I would say is that I think the problem of central banks today is private money creation. The fact that the state is made dependent and hostage on a system of where the creation of money is entirely in the hands of banks. And so there is a problem there. The central banks are, necessitated to sort of bow to the financial sector. And it's, if you will, it's another problem of compenetration between the public and the private. Leah wrote a wonderful book on this, and I don't disagree with Leah's book, which is the idea that the central bank can remain independent, but the legislator needs to maintain control to revise the central bank periodically. And I would agree with that. I'm more skeptical as far as privatization is concerned. Maybe that might be true for central banks, but as far as privatization is concerned as an overarching phenomenon, I don't think when privatization becomes a form of state transformation, it's impossible for the legislator to retain the level of control needed to legitimize exercise of public power in that way vertically. So that would be perhaps my disagreement with that model of legitimation, but otherwise.
Leah, Blake, you want to say something about Leah, especially about the banks, central bank stuff, on which you?
No, I mean, I think that was a very good answer. I mean, I think your point about private money creation is a good one. I mean, in a way, I think the strongest, most radical version of that argument would sort of be almost to say that our system of regulating money creation, which is ostensibly, at least constitutionally in the US, meant to reside in the legislature, is in a sense privatized, right? And in that it primarily happens, not exclusively, of course, but primarily happens in private financial institutions, even if they are sort of contracted and strongly arguably regulated by the public sector. So maybe your argument could apply in that instance. But then I think this is sort of what my question was to you, is sort of like, that seems really fundamental to the state. And so it from a specific argument rather than just the aggregative, even if you still agree with the aggregative argument, I feel more pulled by that example, for instance, of privatization as an individual instance, as being perhaps, I don't know if illegitimate is the right language there. Maybe there's a different thing that we're applying. But anyway, no, I don't have much to say. I'm happy to open it up to everybody else at this point.
Blake,
Yeah, well, I mean, if anyone else has questions, I you know,
anybody have a question?
I'm happy
Vidura?
to yield.
I'm not seeing any hands here, or nobody's reached out to me in the chat. So
You know, before Blake, before you raise a question, I mean, because you've been talking about administrative state, and Nadia made the distinction between democracy and democratic state, which Chiara doesn't fully accept. But the question basically is, what is the relationship between the way the democratic state has evolved into a massive administrative state, and especially in light of the historical evolution of becoming a very complex society. Two examples of the complex society, which one, Chiara at the very end expressed her own puzzlement about how might one manage the modern technologies, especially IT and things like that at this point in time. And then Leah's work with monetary policy, which are modes of privatization, or if we think about them as residing in the private domain, you know, somehow eluding sufficient democratic control. The question basically is whether it is possible to bring them under a kind of democratic purview, and let alone authorization in anything in a significant way, the way something like Nadia thinks about democracy, what democratic will formation means.
So was that question for me or for?
Yeah, but for all of you, I mean, because
well,
you've been working so much on administrative law, and
Yeah.
the way you've been talking about the judicial function and so on. So I would like to get a sense about what democratization of administration means.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that with regard to complex technical questions, with regard to emerging technologies and the like, the solution probably has to involve not legislative specificity beyond very broad commitments, but instead some combination of a civil service ethic that is technically proficient, but more than that's open to the relevant value questions, and then some form of democratic control on that exercise of discretion. And I understand that, and I think there are important questions at issue in the kind of the different wrinkles on that you see in like Leah's work versus Chiara's, about, well, do you want to have some kind of ongoing deliberative participatory process versus some kind of a periodic check-in with the people writ large about whether the authority is being exercised in the relevant way. And I think which answer is right really does depend on context, and I would need to think more about what factors to consider. But like, yeah, it would seem maybe inappropriate in like the monetary policy context to have like deliberative democracy about the interest rate on an ongoing basis. But maybe it would make more sense if we're talking about like AI regulation, that you would need to have ongoing iterative feedback on users and citizens on the way the technologies were operating in order for the administrative officials to exercise the discretion the right kind of way.
I mean, if I may just add very quickly something to what Blake said. So I think there is more than a contextual rationale for preferring a more ongoing forms of public control from below in the democratization as opposed to periodic checks. As I said, the case of central bank might be special because of the nature of monetary policy, might be not. But in general, I think that this account of democratic accountability, like of periodic revisions, rests on a largely unjustified separation between why citizens ought to have control over the ends, but there is no need for them to have some control over the means. And I'm not saying that there is no justification in principle for, I mean, there is a question of expertise and many other, but the truth is that the same kind of profound disagreement that happens at the level of general ends, of policies, of laws, can also happen equally profound and equally reasonable at the level of transforming those general ends into particular applications. So given that the disagreement can be of the same profound kind, if we have reason, as I think we have, not to democratically delegate lawmaking to, say, a benevolent dictator or enlightened monarchs, because he's more expert in reasoning about ends, for the same reason, there is also, I think, we have reasons not to delegate too much of the disagreements about the means to just independent agency of experts. As I said, there are also good reasons for independence, for isolation, for a certain kind of expertise. So I'm not denying any of that. But I think that the periodical revisions mechanism of legitimation relies ultimately on thinking that disagreement about ends is more important than disagreement about means, and I don't think that's correct. So
I think we have two questions from the audience. Lucas, could you please ask your question, and then Behailu, if you could follow up after Lucas. And, we'll take these two questions together so you can, we're a little short on time now, so you can take them together.
Sure. I'm curious to know to what extent you believe your arguments made in the book extend beyond explicit contract to more implicit reliance by the government on private actors. I'm thinking, for example, of FEMA and the Red Cross. I mean, there might not be an explicit contract between the two actors, but in an emergency, there is an understanding that the Red Cross will essentially make policy or provide, public services in conjunction, at the very least, and maybe on behalf of the omnilateral will. Is this qualitatively different from express outsourcing, or is this much the same? Thank you.
Behailu, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah.
Behailu, you're mute. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Chiara, for this wonderful work and in your presentation today. I understand this is a primarily theoretical work, but I wanted to ask whether you draw on the representation of privatization of state in public culture. There is a growing body of work in film, in show business that represent how these privately run prisons and their cost reductions and everything create a mess, and how that creates tension between government-run law enforcement and the privately run prisons and everything. So while your work is highly theoretical, do you draw on this phenomenon's representation in public culture to demonstrate or to exemplify your arguments? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this question. So starting with Lutz's question, I think the argument, the implicit reliance is normatively both less problematic, maybe more problematic. I'm thinking it's less problematic because there is no the appearance. I mean, here it's a bit of a, I didn't intend it like this, but it's almost like a Marxist argument. There is not the appearance of the legitimation of contract. What makes privatization, contractual privatization interesting is that all the legitimation conditions seem to be there. There seems to be nothing wrong with this arrangement from the perspective of legitimacy. And so if you have, and we might think about why the Red Cross is different, but if we think about more obviously negative example where instead we have Elon Musk or social media making unilateral decision about the scope of freedom of expression, say on social media, replacing government in making those decisions, I think there you have a very philosophically uninteresting case of obvious illegitimacy of decision making. The Red Cross case that you mentioned is more interesting because I think if effectively there is an agreement, even if an implicit agreement with the government, that the Red Cross will intervene, and because of that the state does not develop the capacity to intervene, then that case can be treated very much in line with the contractual case. So the fact that the agreement is implicit might not make a huge difference in terms of the normative argument. And turning to the representation of the public culture, no, I don't rely on, the argument does not rely on public representation. It does, however, as perhaps an implication for that, because in thinking about possible ways in which a society can support the role of the civil service and the ethos, I very briefly mention also the importance of cultural representation. So, I mean, if you think about shows like The Office, and a society that encourage people to go into the civil service, that there's a positive representation of the civil service, that connect the civil service with a particular kind of ethos, it's better position to support this model of democracy. And that can happen and perhaps must happen through cultural representations.
Well, we are coming to an end. It is 12 noon. I would like to thank Chiara first and foremost, and our three great respondents, Nadia, Blake, and Leah, and everybody else who was present through this session. Thank you so much for making this 21st session of Questioning the Present such a huge success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
We need it.